Our first guest, Elizabeth Gorin. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
I'm glad to do it, Tim. Think it's an interesting subject, and yes, I do remember.
So at the time, in 1962, you were living in Miami, Florida, correct?
Correct.
And how old were you, Elizabeth?
In 62, I would have been 19.
So you were a young college student or just out of high school?
Just out of high school.
And you were still living at home?
No, I was not.
So you were on your own?
So I was on my own, yes. And it was a shock, the whole Cuban Missile thing. It was, we lived through the Cold War, so we were accustomed to that, but we were not accustomed to something in our backyard. It was in another part of the world, not here. And suddenly it was in our backyard, 90 miles away.
90 miles away, and I think that's an important thing for everybody to understand, 90 miles away. We've got a couple of images we want to show you that are maps of the time that give you a little bit of idea of just in terms of how close that is. We're going to go first of all to what I'm going to name number image 4. So we get a real example of how close Cuba was to the United States, and we see that look up. And what you see here on these different arrows are the distances between Cuba and various locations. And you can see that Miami's very close, for sure, as well as other parts of the United States. And the next map we want to show you, map 24, is actually a declassified CIA map. This map would have been used by the CIA as they were talking to President Kennedy at the time to show him the ranges of different types of missiles that were armed in Cuba. So living in Miami, living in southern Florida, Elizabeth, this was significantly worrisome to you.
Oh, absolutely. It was something we expected. Never expected to happen, but we thought, gee, we're right there. We're going to be hit first. And it was scary, very scary.
Do you remember Kennedy's speech?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do. I don't remember it verbatim, but I remember the feeling that it left. It was just, horrible. It was such a shock. And as I said before, you don't think of anything like that in your backyard.
And you had not always lived in Miami. Your family originally had come from?
New York.
So you had come from like one major city down to Miami.
Right.
Then did you still have family and friends up in New York City as well?
Yes, we did. And of course that was a concern because really, if you think about it logically, Miami wouldn't be a prime target. New York and Washington would be the prime targets, not Miami. And of course when we thought about it, that worried us too. But of course, this was in a time where everyone was fearful of radiation and fallout and what have you. So just hitting anywhere in America was a terrible thing, and it frightened us all.
And we've got an image of you up now from that period of time so that people can see Elizabeth back then. And that handsome man with you is?
That was a high school boyfriend.
Ah, memories. They light the corners of your mind, Elizabeth. So let's begin to go to some questions from our student groups, because I know they're going to have questions for you and all of our guests. And I'm going to start out in Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, with Westmont Hilltop High School. Because, Sean, I know you've got a first question about discovery of missiles. So, Sean, I'll go to you if you'd like to introduce yourself and speak loudly and proudly. What's your question?
How did the United States discover missiles in Cuba?
Thanks, Sean. That's a great question. He asked specifically about how we discovered the missiles in Cuba. Now, Kennedy spoke a little bit about that in his speech, right? Did you begin then to learn how we understood the missiles were there?
It was because of the U-2 spy planes that they flew very high altitudes with cameras that could pick up things on the ground. This was before satellites. The satellites weren't around.
And that's an important thing, I think, for our audience to understand, especially our young audience of students. There are a few satellites up in the sky, but they don't have the kind of capability that we do today, obviously, of zeroing in on location. So we were using spy planes, and we've got a couple of images for you. We'll begin by looking at image 26, which is of a U-2 spy plane. This is probably the most famous of the spy planes that would have been utilized during the Cold War. You may be familiar with Gary Powers, a U-2 spy plane pilot who was shot down over the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. This plane would have been flying high-level reconnaissance missions for sure. But there's another really interesting spy plane that was built by McDonnell Douglas right here in St. Louis, known as the Voodoo. And we're going to bring up that image now. And this plane actually gave us a lot of the low-level reconnaissance flights that really let us see the missile sites up close and personal so far. And we're going to give you guys a chance to look at those sites as we begin to answer Sean's question. So I want to first, as we look at these pictures, bring up images. We'll go to 12 and 13 because you're going to see a couple of images of Cuba here. and you're going to notice there's some differences between the two images. So if we look at this one, this is a place in Cuba which at this point in time doesn't look like anything's happening. This image was actually taken in late August of 1962. However, notice the area in the box that you're going to see there over on the left-hand side of the picture. As we switch to the next image, which was taken in the middle of October 1962, this is what was existing at that time then in that box that we just saw. So by the time that October rolled around, they indeed had all sorts of things about nuclear warhead sites, they had construction materials, they had all sorts of reasons to believe that this was a definite nuclear location. Our next two images show you the exact same things. We'll bring up image 14 first, which again shows you an area of Cuba in late August, where ideally speaking you don't see a heck of a lot, but some clouds and open farmland. But as we go to the next image, 15, you're going to notice that at this point in time, the site has become quite different. And this is a close-up picture taken from that Voodoo aircraft, where you can really see the fact that there's all sorts of trucks, track marks because of construction. They believe that there's a missile erector just behind that long building you see in the center of the picture. All of these things would have been analyzed by CIA operatives. And it's this kind of pictures, Elizabeth, that eventually the media was showing and you guys were aware that were out there?
Yes, we saw the pictures, but like satellite pictures today, we couldn't see as well as the experts, but we believed them.
That's right. I think that's an important thing for everybody to understand, is that you have to trust that the experts are identifying the objects correctly. This is a missile site, this is a missile erector, these are trucks, this is a weapon itself.
Exactly, exactly.
Newsreel footage of the time can really be helpful. And of course, today when you go to movies, you don't see newsreels at all. But back when I was a small kid, you could go to the movies and you'd see newsreels all the time. And here's some newsreel footage of the U-2 spy plane.
The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet. Literally, thousands of pictures can be made on each flight by these planes, and they are studied by photo interpreters who are capable of analyzing details that an untrained eye would miss. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets.
So besides the fact that I just love hearing that great narrator voice of the newsreel footage, which brings back all sorts of memories, there you see an example of the U-2 spy plane in operation, and the size of that camera, my gosh, that camera is huge. And of course, technology is amazing today. You don't have to worry about that. Let's see what other questions students have. Let's go to Slater, Missouri. Slater, what's the question that you guys have? Unmute your microphone, identify yourself, come on in.
50 years after the crisis, how often do you think about it?
Oh, there's a great question. 50 years after the crisis, Elizabeth, how often do you think about it? Had it crossed your mind before all this media play, before we came out here and said, hey, Elizabeth, don't you remember?
You don't think of it on a day-to-day basis, but when you have something similar happen, like I wonder how the Israelis feel about Iran, and I imagine it's pretty much the way we felt about Cuba. So it comes up in something like that, but not on a daily basis.
Great question, Slater. Thanks very much. Let's go to Illinois. St. Michael's School, a question from you guys.
Hi. How did your everyday life change during the 13 days of October?
So how did your daily life change, he wants to know. Do you remember certain things?
Made it a point to listen to the news and had the radio on in the car and frequently listening in to see what was going on. Other than that, we still went on with our daily lives.
And I think that's an interesting thing to consider, because the students that we're dealing with right now in terms of high school and middle school kids have very few memories of an event that would be similar to this, in terms of like suddenly we're all going to pay attention to the news media and we're going to look at something. Because even in terms of 2000, even in terms of 9/11, that would have been 11 years ago. And so even if you're 15 at this point, what do you remember as a 4-year-old about that? But the same kind of experience, everyone's glued to the TV set watching the news come across. Let's go to our final interactive group out there to Westchester Opportunity Center in Yonkers, New York. Yonkers, a question from you all?
I wanted to know, what safeguards did you and your family and community make in preparation for the event of nuclear war, and what relief did you feel to know that they weren't needed after a while?
Super question in terms of the safeguards that your family took and the whole nation was taking in terms of preparing for nuclear war and some emergency action. I'm going to let you speak to that because we've got some great video for the students to see as well that deals with that.
Well, first of all, most of us felt like there wasn't a whole lot we could do. We did have neighbors. We had one particular neighbor that at the time we thought they were a little crazy. They built a bomb shelter. But when this happened, when the crisis happened, we thought maybe they're not so stupid after all. But you think of it logically, the bomb shelter wouldn't have done any good, and not in Miami. It's not that deep. But there wasn't a whole lot we could do. I do know that my grandmother, when it happened, ran to the grocery store and bought a lot of sugar because she went through a sugar shortage during World War II, and she didn't want that to happen again.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing for the students to understand is that people who were adults at this time had lived through significant other events in their youth, World War II, which certainly colored their vision of how they were going to respond to this.
Right, and that was the big thing. She realized that she had, because there was rationing during the war, that sugar was the most important thing to her. But most of us, we just had to go on with our daily lives. There wasn't anything we could do about it.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for being here.